let's talk a little bit about the Cyber Resilience Act, which is a new legislation in Europe. Because the Cyber Resilience Act is targeting to regulate the software space from cybersecurity perspective, trying to make sure that the software-based products and services are well maintained and secure, because the EU Commission recognizes that most people live their lives through digital services. And that means that we are always threatened by cybersecurity vulnerabilities and attacks. The CRA itself was not created to regulate open source. However, when open source is part of a product or service that is made available as part of a company's business on the EU market, that open source project and code becomes subject to the CRA. You would think that the open source communities will be responsible for that too. That is not the case anymore, because the EU regulation says that the company who brings the product and service that contains the open source component onto the EU market, they are responsible for reporting the vulnerability that they found in that software component, but they are also responsible to submit the fix for that vulnerability if they have it. What the CRA says in practice is that if you are a company who is integrating and relying on an open source project and component, fixing bugs and vulnerabilities is your responsibility. So the responsibility chain ends with you. There is no way to point fingers at the open source community that this is their responsibility to fix a particular bug or vulnerability. It is now your responsibility as a company or organization, again, who has a product on the EU market. That also means that if you are located outside the EU, but you shipped, again, products or services to that market, the CRA applies to you just as much as it applies to everybody else in the EU. Open source projects should have good security measures and practices. They should have a vulnerability process that is documented and is easy to find, discover, and follow for users and contributors of that project, which will make it much easier for companies and organizations to go and report those bugs and vulnerabilities that they found in the software. If you are concerned that you're reporting a vulnerability that is not fixed yet, and it will be public information how to exploit that vulnerability, then most projects who do have a vulnerability process also have an embargo process built into that, which means that the information about the vulnerability will not be disclosed until the vulnerability does have a fix, and for users a way to apply that fix in their environments. If the project that you are dependent on does not have a clear vulnerability process, or it does not have an embargo period baked into that process, this is your opportunity to get involved and propose one. In the commercial context, open source is sustainable software development. So if you think about public infrastructure, like the roads out there that are maintained by the country's governments in most cases, they are part of the public good. Everyone relies on them. So it is everybody's responsibility to have them maintained. And that's why we pay taxes. And also people work in the industry who go and fixes these roads. Open source software is very similar, because all of us are relying on open source software and software infrastructure that depends on open source code. So why aren't we maintaining that infrastructure together? And it's not just the concept of maintaining something together that we all rely on. In fact, it is much cheaper and more efficient to do maintenance work and development work upstream in these open source projects that are high priority dependencies for companies. If everyone does that, then we will not have burnt out maintainers, and you will have the vulnerability fixes, the bug fixes available faster, and everyone who relies on that particular project will have them as well. So we can all share the burden. You can invest in the maintenance of these software components, especially if they are high up on your dependency tree and they are high priority dependencies for you. You can, let's say, quote unquote, pay taxes and support open source foundations, as well as support the communities directly with funding. And what you should absolutely do if the open source project is part of your product or core service, you need to invest in doing maintenance and development work upstream, because that is the missing piece that will make it sustainable for you to keep maintaining your product and service that does have open source components built into it. And not just because of the CRA, but if you miss doing at least some of the maintenance work upstream, then the CRA penalties are actually pretty high. By the end of 2027, you will have to be compliant with the CRA regulations. So look into the deadlines as well as the progress of the standardization work, things that, for example, ETSI is doing as a standards body that the Linux Foundation is now a member of, so that open source projects and communities can participate in the standardization efforts a little more closer to make sure that the standards are applying well to open source projects so that the CRA doesn't make things any harder than they already are, as well as look into the OpenSSF Foundation, who is working on both providing resources and materials about the CRA, working with policy makers to roll out the faces of the CRA, as well as working with open source projects and communities to make sure that they are compliant with regulations, as well as have good security processes and measures.